There is mounting confusion this evening over the fate of the border crossing at Rafah crossing between Egypt and the Gaza Strip, as contradictory statements continue to emerge from both the Israeli and Palestinian sides. On one hand, Israel has made clear that the crossing will not reopen at this time. According to a statement from the office of Benjamin Netanyahu, the reopening of Rafah will be considered based on how Hamas fulfills its part in returning the bodies of the hostages and in implementing the agreed-upon framework. The Israeli position is that 18 corpses of Israeli hostages remain in Gaza, and one more was identified just in the early hours of this morning. At the same time, the Palestinian embassy in Egypt announced that the crossing would reopen on Monday for Palestinians who are registered and wish to return to Gaza. Their statement urges returnees residing in Egypt to file their information via a designated online system. The result is what might best be described as a diplomatic stalemate. Israel insists the crossing remains closed until a full and verifiable handover of hostages, dead and alive, takes place. The Palestinians appear to believe preparations for reopening are underway, yet Israel's refusal casts heavy doubt over that scenario. Amid this, the broader ceasefire arrangement in place between Israel and Hamas remains fragile. Israel claims that 9 people were killed by Israeli fire in Gaza City while in a vehicle that Israel describes as suspicious. Hamas disputes the incident, calling it a violation of the ceasefire by Israel. There is no clearly demarcated yellow line within Gaza indicating the pullback of Israeli forces, meaning interpretation of events on the ground remain highly contested. In Israel, anger is growing. The families of hostages are protesting in Tel Aviv, demanding the swift return of the bodies and survivors. Israeli authorities say that many of the deceased remain trapped beneath rubble and collapsed tunnels, complicating the retrieval efforts. Moving forward, Monday may prove crucial. Israeli media, backed by multiple sources, are reporting that JD Vance, Vice President of the United States, will visit Israel, accompanied by US Middle East envoy Steve Witkoff, to discuss the next phase of the agreement. The trip is described as aimed at transitioning to the second stage of the deal, which so far has seen partial hostage returns and a pause in major hostilities. While the ceasefire holds for now, diplomatic and humanitarian pressures remain intense, access for aid into Gaza, the question of how many hostages remain and how their bodies will be retrieved, and the prospect of whether the Rafah crossing will reopen all hang in the balance. One of the main sticking points in the current impasse is the status of Israeli hostages held by Hamas. According to media reports, Hamas has returned the bodies of 10 deceased Israelis to date, including one identified this morning, 75-year-old Eliyahu Margalit, who was taken into Gaza on 7th October 2023, then killed and held in Gaza. His remains were repatriated overnight and identified by Israeli authorities. Nonetheless, Israel's government says that 18 bodies remain unreturned. This delays consideration of reopening the Rafah crossing and restricts the ability to advance into the next phase of the ceasefire deal. Meanwhile, Hamas claims challenges in locating many bodies due to the extensive destruction in Gaza. Tunnels collapsed, burial sites obliterated, access severely restricted. Israel views the slow pace as unacceptable and uses it as a pressure point in the ongoing negotiations. The crossing at Rafah is critically important. It is the largest border crossing between Egypt and the Gaza Strip, and its reopening would allow people, and potentially aid, to move in and out of Gaza with relative ease, a vital relief to the humanitarian crisis inside Gaza. The Palestinian embassy in Egypt stated the Rafah border crossing will open starting Monday to enable Palestinians residing in Egypt who wish to return to Gaza to travel, according to the established coordination mechanism. However, Israel's position, echoed in the Prime Minister's office, is unequivocal. Its reopening will be considered based on how Hamas fulfills the part in returning the hostages' remains and implementing the agreed-upon framework. Thus, although some see Monday as a potential reopening date, Israel has effectively denied that it will happen unless and until the required conditions are met. This disagreement underlines the current mistrust and fragility of the truce arrangement. The ceasefire, which took effect between Israel and Hamas, followed a long and devastating period of conflict, triggered by Hamas's attack on the 7th of October 2023 and Israel's subsequent military operations in Gaza. This pause in open hostilities is seen as provisional and heavily conditioned on follow-through. In recent days, Israel has reduced humanitarian aid into Gaza and kept the Rafah crossing closed, citing Hamas's failure to comply with the agreement's terms. Hamas, in turn, accuses Israel of violating the ceasefire by striking in Gaza City and causing civilian casualties, refusing to recognize the line drawn by the Israeli military for its pullback. The death of 9 people in Gaza City, claimed by Hamas to have been killed by Israeli fire, is part of that contentious narrative. The visit of Vice President JD Vance and envoy Steve Witkoff to Israel this coming Monday is being viewed as a critical moment. According to multiple sources, the visit will center on whether to move from Phase A of the agreement, hostage returns, initial withdrawal, into Phase B, which contemplates broader aid flows, civilian-administered zones in Gaza, and an international mechanism for stabilization. One senior source told reporters that the United States is fully engaged in this effort and has shown no sign of easing off the gas. The US goal appears to be to keep the momentum rather than allow the deal to stall. However, whether the US visit will make a difference depends heavily on whether Israel and Hamas can find enough trust and compliance to proceed. If Israel feels Hamas continues to drag its feet, it may refuse to loosen its grip or open the crossing and could resume military operations. Alternatively, if Hamas moves quickly to return the remaining hostages' bodies and cooperate, the crossing might yet open and aid flows improve. On the ground in Gaza, the humanitarian situation remains dire. Aid delivery into the enclave has been severely constrained, due in part to the crossing closures and Israel's restrictions. According to one UN estimate, an average of 560 metric tons of food enters Gaza each day, far less than is needed to sustain the population. Opening the Rafah crossing would be a significant relief to Gazans who have been unable to leave for medical treatment and to Palestinians stuck in Egypt unable to return home. But Israel's insistence that opening depends on hostage-related conditions means the humanitarian dimension is tied directly to the security and diplomatic agenda. In the original statements, there's been a lot of confusion all week when it comes to the Rafah crossing, Israel announcing that it wasn't going to be reopened as planned due to this delay in returning the bodies of deceased hostages. Its reopening will be considered based on whether Hamas returns deceased hostages and implements the agreed-upon framework. It seems the Rafah won't be reopening, according to the Israelis, and that's because 18 deceased hostages remain in Gaza. He said the crossing would not be reopening. I heard also from a UN source who'd also heard the same thing, that Rafah was reopening, that it wouldn't be reopened to aid. He said this visit from the US Vice President could be key not just on it holding, but also crucially on what happens. All of these taken together reflect both the on-the-ground confusion and the diplomatic high stakes. As of now, Israel holds firm. The Rafah crossing remains closed until further notice, pending action by Hamas. The Palestinian embassy in Egypt is publicly preparing for a Monday reopening, albeit likely limited to people returning from Egypt. That may or may not include humanitarian aid flows. The US is stepping in to attempt to keep the process moving. Vice President Vance and envoy Witkoff are expected in Israel on Monday to discuss implementation of the next phase of the deal. The hostages' remains remain a central sticking point. Until those bodies are returned and confirmed, Israel is unlikely to loosen its conditions. Humanitarian needs remain acute in Gaza. The crossing's reopening is a key enabler of aid delivery, but the timing is uncertain. For the hostages and their families, every day of delay in returning the deceased or rescuing survivors deepens grief, frustration, and anger. The protests in Israel reflect this. For the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, the longer Rafah remains closed, the more constrained the aid flows and the more acute civilian suffering becomes. For the ceasefire and broader peace process, this is a test of whether a fragile truce can transition into something more durable. If the hostages clause isn't met and border access remains stalled, the risk of renewed conflict rises. For US diplomacy, the visit of Vice President Vance signals that Washington still sees leverage and wants to maintain momentum, but it is also a signal that time is of the essence. For regional dynamics, the Egypt-Gaza connection via Rafah is critical for Gaza's relationship with the outside world. If that link remains blocked, Gaza remains more isolated and dependent. Will Hamas hand over further bodies of deceased hostages, and will Israel verify and accept them? Will Israel agree to reopen Rafah for Palestinians returning and potentially for humanitarian aid? Under what conditions? What messages will Vice President Vance deliver during his visit to Israel? Will he press Israel, Hamas, Egypt, or propose new mechanisms? Will humanitarian access into Gaza improve in the next days, or will restrictions remain? Will violations or incidents along the ceasefire line trigger renewed violence, undermining the truce? What happens after Monday? Will there be a phase B of the deal, and if so, what will it include?